Thank you. I know it's late. I'll battle your jet lag with enthusiasm. I am not a scholar of Chinese history, but a scholar of US literature. As it crosses over into history and many topics, first, thank you for the invitation. So Professor Chun, thank you for the Institute inviting me. Shugo Chi, thank you for the invitation. Beth and Hilson for all your planning behind the scenes, much appreciated. And Professor So for your comments. So I'm going to read today, and this is from a chapter that I'm writing, so I'll get started. Today, catchphrases of free trade continue to saturate policy papers and legislation that have swung from delight in strategic advantage of cooperation to disputation amidst laments of geopolitical consequences related to protectionism. My scholarship on the first century of Chinese-US commercial, diplomatic, and literary relations tracks phrases such as free trade, the free press, Christendom, civilization back across centuries of primary texts, across diverse genres of literary fiction, biography, periodicals, treaties, diplomatic dispatches, federal legal rulings, and more. As in today's presentation, I set scenes of inter-imperial and intercultural material print production to highlight the conceptual development of political economy and related terms such as the nation and sovereignty. To wit, in 1838, the American missionary Reverend Elijah C. Bridgman of the American Board of Commissions of Foreign Missions, or the ABCFM, was the first to introduce the U.S. Declaration of Independence to Qing readership. With the 2026 approach marking the 250th anniversary of the Declaration, Bridgman's first rendering offers a chance to consider the Declaration's significance in understanding the longer history of Chinese-US commercial and diplomatic relations, and the scholarship explaining the rise of international law as it eclipsed the law of nations. Bridgman presents a loose but substantial translation of the Declaration in Chapter 4 of A Brief Account of the United States of America, or 美利国和社国之日. The first edition of 1838 was very much shaped by historical events culminating in the First Opium War. He began writing the account while living in Canton and employed Chinese engravers to produce its woodblocks as tensions intensified over opium smuggling. In 1837, Bridgman secretly cached the blocks on opium ships anchored at Linton Island before shipping them to his ABCFM compatriot, the Reverend Ira Tracy in Singapore for printing. Bridgman then published two revised editions, the first from Hong Kong in 1844, and the second from Shanghai in 1861, the year of his death. In regard to the diplomatic stakes of trade, Bridgman's translation is Janus-faced in addressing Qing readership, as he presents trade as the right and duty of being a good neighbor. On the one hand, he explains the US revolution against King George III in ways that align the US with Qing sovereignty in promising trade that benefits citizens and those on the state's territorial frontiers. On the other hand, Bridgman implicitly warns the Qing that regulating trade through the Canton system sets it apart from all other good neighbor trading partners of the United States. Of course, the literal existence of trade, its action, its social realization is not the concern here. Trade was going on. It was the terms of regulation and how that related to understandings of sovereignty. Bridgman's revision reinforces the moral terms of trade as not only a right but an obligation, echoing a legacy of philosophy and natural history shaped by two golden rules of the New Testament: the Great Commission, to preach the word to every living creature, and the Great Commandment, love one's neighbor as oneself. The following presentation unfolds in three parts. First, it summarizes how in the original Declaration, free trade was an important premise upon which the colonists appealed to the sovereign powers of the earth to recognize their sovereignty apart from Great Britain. To this end, the British king's embargoes and blockades on American colonial ports and his incitement of frontier violence by merciless savages amounted to tyrannical abuse that invalidated the king as the, quote, head of a civilized nation. The second part sketches the intercultural scene of print activity and Canton amidst the Qing regulation of trade in opium smuggling by Western merchants before the First Opium War. In 1838, Bridgman reframed the declaration to tout the expansive commercial frontier of the United States while calling the Qing to embrace the moral duty of expanding its territorial domain by deregulating Canton. One major revision Bridgman makes in doing this is to replace the stereotypical merciless frontier savages of the original declaration with a stereotypical noble savagery that he designates as Maoren. Bridgman's comparative savagery here draws the US and Qing together as potential good neighbors while admonishing the Qing on the moral duty to trade. The third part probes how Bridgman, in his presentation of the Declaration of Independence, echoes these ABCFM allegories of global print evangelism, specifically the above-mentioned Great Commission and Great Commandment. Recognizing these allegories shows how Bridgman's address of the Qing as potential good neighbors reflects a long array of debate over the basis of jus gentium, the law of nations, and its supposed shading into positive international law in the 19th century. Because this is part of a longer project, the presentation moves swiftly towards conclusion by acknowledging the ethical double bind of Chinese assistants who aided Bridgman in bringing a brief account into print publication. This double bind sheds light on the overtly exclusionary principles of international law set by W.A.P. Martin in the later 19th century through his translation of Henry Wheaton's Elements of International Law as Wangguo Gongfa. Of course, scholarship on the Declaration is immense, parsing events leading to Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration in June 1776, debate and revision of the Second Continental Congress, and John Dunlop's printing of broadsides for dissemination across the 13 colonies, across the Atlantic Ocean to the United Kingdom and states of Europe, whom signers hoped to court as potential allies. With a focus on consolidating domestic national unity that achieved sovereignty, Carl Becker and Gary Wills in 1922 and 1978 respectively offered a history of ideas behind its publication, highlighting John Locke and Scottish empiricism as a key inspiration. Other scholars have probed the Declaration's aesthetics of eloquence and oratorical performance in adapting classical Republican governments to virtues of marketplace competition. And Pauline Maier has explained how the Declaration grew into a sacred symbol of national origin and patriotic pride only decades after the Treaty of Paris in 1783 and the aftermath of War of 1812 and the defeat of Napoleon, as the integrity of the United States stabilized amidst compromises over slavery, upset and reconfigured in the shadow of federal Indian policies of Indian removal supported by Supreme Court decisions. Now, to understand Bridgman's Chinese language version of the Declaration, it helps first to look at the original in a global network of international diplomacy as proposed by David Armitage, Mark Weston-Janis, and others. Both emphasize Amir Vital's influential The Law of Nations, 1757, copies of which Benjamin Franklin distributed among delegates in the spring of 1776 to shape the Declaration's primary purpose, to express the international legal sovereignty of the United States by appealing to other sovereign states for recognition. This primary purpose of establishing recognition from other states is today eclipsed by what has become the Declaration's most recognized language on universal individual rights premised on natural law. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Armitage, Janis, and J.G.A. Pocock have pointed out that such individual rights were predicated on the state securing them as a sovereign state, as recognized by other states. The Declaration thus makes a case for state sovereignty with deference and respect, quote, to the opinions of mankind, and appealing to the established powers of the earth to determine, based on facts, that the U.S. indeed deserved the power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliance, and conduct commerce. In pursuing its primary objective, then, the Declaration proclaims revolution on conservative terms. The goal is taking up among powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. Such freedom implied that U.S. independence was predicated on interdependence among those existing powers of the earth. Now, the primary state-making purpose of the Declaration registers in how the 27 charges leveled against King George III overlooks slavery and characterizes merciless savages. The Declaration makes its case as if it were a civil trial, following William Blackstone's definition of a declaration, narration, or count by which a plaintiff sets forth its cause. The Declaration lays out 27 charges in Section 3, all prefaced by he, and 9 subheadings under number 13 of he, of 4. Trade features explicitly under the 13th charge. And you have it here, the king, for cutting off trade, colonial trade with all parts of the world. Now, the 19th charge is the final one. He has excited domestic insurrection among us, has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Now, the original declaration does not go into detail about how the king cuts off maritime trade. There's no mention of the East India Company, as Bridgman would mention it. Instead, the declaration focuses on military blockades on port cities, hinterland disruption on the frontier by exciting these merciless Indian savages. In sharpening the grievances against the king regarding trade, the primary goal of securing state sovereignty evinces the secondary concern of universal equality of individuals outside the state. As Armitage explains, Article 1 of the Peace of Paris, 1783, definitively concluded the Declaration's purpose when Great Britain acknowledged the U.S. as sovereign. How then to resolve the tension between the 13 sovereign independent states that had rhetorically presented themselves as one people? To do so, the U.S. Constitution set aside the equality of humankind in compromising over slavery, as the French Revolution unleashed universal rights that threatened the premise of centralized federal governance of the 13 states and the priority of preserving property at the center of the U.S. Constitution. It was not until the 1820s, after the War of 1812, that the Declaration not only resurrected into American scripture its national origin, but also became a key tool of civil rights for those deprived of legal standing. The second paragraph's declaration of all men created equal, featuring in David Walker's appeal to colored citizens of the world in 1829, the Pequot activist and Methodist minister William Appis's An Indian Looking Glass for the White Man in 1830, and in later speeches by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, by Frederick Douglass, and eventually by Abraham Lincoln. Bridgman's declaration does not follow in this line of individual rights activism. Rather, he uses the Declaration as a diplomatic tool to forge reciprocal recognition of pure sovereignty with the Qing, predicated on trade and diplomacy, as he admonishes them over the consequences of not doing so. In 1838, Ira Tracy from Singapore published 每了一个是国之律 from Singapore. The body of the text had been engraved in Canton. The title page had probably been carved later in Singapore. It indicates the date as the 18th year of Deng Guan's reign. Bridgman and Liang Zhi are noted as the authors and helpers. In 1844, as I mentioned, Bridgman revised it, as he does again in 1861. These dates, 1838, 1844, 1861, mark distinct stages in Bridgman's career. To understand the first phase, it helps to explain what inspired him to go to South China and how his evangelicalism was supported. In 1829, the 27-year-old Bridgman was fresh out of Andover Theological Seminary and joined the ABCFM. the organization founded in 1810 by conservative standing order ministers, wealthy American merchants, and enthusiastic students. The ABCFM then sent dozens of missionaries across the globe, beyond the nation's borders, into the world. And you have a map here that visualizes and summarizes the extent of missions from 1810 to 1860, the first 50 years. Just for reference, here you have, all of the places that go in chronological order. Note that India, Turkey, later China, Africa, and the North American Indian missions here too. It's a fascinating map. Now, as this was happening, from headquarters in Boston, the ABCFM administrators oversaw this entire global print network, stretching from Bengal to Cherokee lands to Sandwich Islands, then called Palestine and elsewhere. Bridgman and his compatriot David Abiel arrived to Canton in 1830, and the British LMS, London Missionary Society missionary, Reverend Robert Morrison, took them under his wing. Morrison had long had a connection with the founders of the ABCFM that began in 1807, when he visited New York and Philadelphia on his way to China and secured from Secretary of State James Madison a letter of introduction to U.S. merchants there in order to skirt the EIC ban on missionaries. Ironically, the EIC soon employed Morrison as its chaplain and translator. For the next 3 decades, Morrison worked with fellow British missionaries, William Milne, Walter Methurst, and others, and Chinese assistants, most prominently Lang Afa. In addition to translating the Bible and publishing dictionaries, he helped found the Anglo-Chinese College at Malacca, where much of the printing took place beyond the jurisdiction of Qing authorities. In 1820, Morrison formed a friendship with the New York merchant David Washington Cincinnati Oliphant, an anti-opium merchant. They lobbied the ABCFM to support missionaries, and in 1832, helped Bridgman found the Canton Mission Press as the newest and smallest ABCFM print station. He collaborated with Lang Afa, whose son Lang Ate he tutored, as he established the Chinese repository. Ran for 20 years, it was a monthly. First issue in May 1832. In 1833, the ABCFM printer Samuel Wells Williams and Reverend Ira Tracy, for previously mentioned, arrived to augment Bridgman's efforts. Now, what you have here is the repository, the 2 main characters of my printing, ABCF printing station here, and the actual hand press, not the actual, but the model that Bridgman would have received, funded by the ABCFM and congregations back in New York on Bleecker Street. Meanwhile, in Boston, a new wave of administration was taking over, including Andover graduate Rufus Anderson, who'd set up policies regarding, well, all the finances of the ABCFM. Should they print? Should they teach? How should they print? During an era of Indian removal of the Cherokees, and as fiscal crisis smashed the economy in 1837. There's time here only to mention that Anderson and Bridgman argued over the best methods of printing Chinese. Bridgman, in cooperation with Morrison and LMS printers, eventually advocated for metallic types that promised, quote, a font of perpetuity, a limitless horizon of production and distribution until, I suppose, the day of judgment. Rufus Anderson wanted to economize, advocating for woodblock engraving. As you see here, Robert Morrison also woodblock engraved, or this is his Lord's Prayer. Actually, it is the Lord's Prayer later, but this is the Sermon on the Mount. And xylography, so the carving into these woodblocks. Now, he also wanted to use this, and did, to produce what he called, in the ABCFM monthly, The Missionary Herald, the first Chinese ever printed in the United States. And that is from this woodblock, sent back with Chinese paper to Boston, and stamped out on a stereotype plate, a thin piece of metal from which the Sermon on the Mount was printed. And it was then stitched into the Missionary Herald, as you see here. Now, the other thing the ABCFM did is write their own history. In 1840, the first major one appeared, written by Ira Tracy's brother, Joseph Tracy. He's credited with coming up with the term the Great Awakening, the title of his 1845 History of American Missions. In 1861, they published together, Rufus Anderson and Joseph Tracy, the memorial volume of the first 50 years of the ABCFM. Now get this. According to the table of productivity, the Canton Mission Press had printed more than 25 million pages in English, Chinese, and other languages over its 25 years in operation. These operations ended at the beginning of the Second Opium War, when the entire print station burnt to the ground. As for the comprehensive tally of the ABCFM printing outside the United States, the memorial tallied 1.77 billion pages, billion with a B, attributed to 15 printing stations, 45 presses, and across 42 languages of the world. Now, in May 1833, as Bridgman inaugurated the second year of the Chinese repository, he presented a bright prospect of the synergy between trade and print evangelism, looking to the expiration of the EIC monopoly and free trade. Introducing the first issue of the Chinese repository for that year, Bridgman reached back to his readings at Andover to aver, from what a professor had written, that the Sermon of the Mount and the Book of Proverbs contain the elements of best political economy ever devised, exceeding the volumes of Adam Smith and the statistics of Sabert and Pitkin. The decade would be profoundly disappointing, but did prove that the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself could be very useful in figuring through the diplomatic contradictions of proclaiming free trade while practicing opium smuggling. In the early 1834, Reverend Morrison and his son published the Commercial Guide of 1834 and opined that after the expiration of the EIC's monopoly, free trade would flourish and Western merchants could band together and pressure the Qing to deregulate trade and lift sanctions on printing and preaching by foreigners. Instead, the Qing intensified enforcement, targeting Chinese assistants. Liang Afa was again arrested, and after his release, ended up in Singapore with Ira Tracy. Meanwhile, the Canton Mission Press moved its equipment to Macau, where Bridgman and Williams continued to write, edit, and print. In the next 3 years, they resorted to hiding publications on Linton Island and its ships anchored there, lamenting the sad irony that the Opium Depot was preserving their efforts. In the autumn of 1834, things proved especially calamitous. Bridgman delivered 2 major eulogies. The first was for Reverend Morrison himself, who died of fever on the 1st of October. The second was for William Napier, who died Morrison dies in August. Napier dies in October. Napier had arrived as the British Chief Superintendent of Trade to replace the second committee representative of the EIC. He then roiled the entire Canton system, demanding to meet directly with Qing officials of similar rank rather than Hong merchants. Now, as the political environment deteriorated, Bridgman worked on his brief account, which started as one of the several projects associated with the founding of the Society of Diffusion of Useful Knowledge in September of 1834. As the scholar Yao Dao Tui and others have been shown, Bridgman depended on Chinese translators and engravers across his versions of this brief account. In 1836, Liang Afa's son, Liang Jiande, had followed the orders of Lin Zixu to translate portions of Hugh Murray's Encyclopedia of Geography. He would later go on to help with translations throughout the Opium War and into the treaties. In 1861, in Shanghai, Bridgman printed the final version with the help of Guan Xiaoyi. As for Bridgman's influence, the influence of his account, in 1847, missionaries in Xiamen reported that it had been distributed to dozens and dozens of literati and men of influence and officials. It influenced directly Wei Yun, who borrowed and published part of it in Haiguo Tuzhi, and elsewhere. All right, goes to Japan, comes back, circulates. Now, Bridgman's brief account comprises 2 major parts and opens with a brief autobiographical preface and an introduction that explains how the book's punctuation marks work. He apologizes for its brevity, characterizing it as a work in progress, to which he invites other contributors to follow. It's very similar to Thomas Jefferson's notes in the state of Virginia in that way. Now, part one consists of 27 chapters, beginning with the New World discovery, colonial settlement, U.S. independence, and frames the central governance of the United States in the U.S. Constitution, like it's how it's ordered at the federal and state level. Chapters describe the native peoples of the American continent, trade, agriculture, manufacture, culture, education, book publication, dress, habits. One chapter presents a descriptive overview of the Roman alphabet, Romanized alphabet, and how it works. Part two then gives you a survey of the 26 states, describing their topographies, key commodities, institutions of worship and education, technologies of printing, transportation, and agricultural production. Now, what I want to look more carefully at is first his short preface that showcases how he uses the Sermon on the Mount and some key biblical phrases to set the premise of communication for a global economy of commerce that connects the U.S. to the chain. So here we have 从来以天下为一家中国也依然这子物主知识之海附体某不及同也 I won't torture you further. But I do, I've read this over and over again. I'm happy to read it with you. But the key feature here is what Bridgman is saying is we're all one family, right? And he's basically drawing this broad geographical connection that draws straight on, well, a couple key, let's read here, it's fast. His tone is very modest, even humble and friendly in this introduction. He's disarming and deftly folds the world as a material globe into a unit of humans inhabiting it. It's a global geography and a cosmology premised on Christendom, a faith of a universal God that, as a philosophy of political economy, this one-body metaphor makes communication, travel, trade, printing the path to realizing equality among all individuals and peoples of the world. Now, John Winthrop's model of Christian charity, a famous sermon with the city on the hill of 1630, was just now, in these years, being rediscovered. And it's unclear whether Bridgman actually saw it, or that he very well might have. But he's definitely alluding to Matthew 5:44 and Ephesians 4:16 that ensures that we must love one's neighbor as ourselves, and through God's love, knit all parts of ourselves together as individuals and as faith communities in one body of Christ premised on love. He employs phrases familiar to Chinese readers, including some, and also some idioms, but also the way he uses particles. Talk more about the style in which these missionaries from Morrison to Medhurst to Gutslav to Bridgman and Williams were trying to figure out how to catch the right type of writing for Chinese readership. And he also, as I think I mentioned, he basically charts the entire narrative of US development in terms of a chronology by using imperial dynasties, from the Ming Emperor Hongzhi through Qinlong, Jiaqing, and finally Doguang. He projects this universal body and human family in ways that run counter, of course, to the imperial terms of Tianxia as an ontology of governing spirit rather than territory. The distinctions between Hua and Yi disappear. And of course, the Canton system of regulation becomes something that's anti-neighborly. Now, I'm not going to go into what you all very well know, but I'm drawing on many scholars who have talked specifically about the tributary system, aspects of Tianxia as it changed over time, Wang Hui, Gongwu Wang. Now, I'm interested in that too, but the ways in which Bridgman's making a diplomatic intervention and draws on scholarship by Zhe Guangyin and Lydia Liu, who have offered a parallel attempt by Lin Zixu to align Tian Sha with the law of nations of Vattel. And the letter to the Queen, 1839, that asserts that opium smuggling must indeed rouse indignation in every human heart, Renqing, and violate all terms of reasonable governance, Tianli. Right? Bridgman's not doing that, although he's writing this brief account at the same time that this letter to the Queen Victoria is being composed. Right? So one of the key tensions I'm going to come back to is, what's the difference? Like, what's this one body idea, this one body solution that Bridgman's coming up with? In calibrating the original declaration's layers of global significance, including authors and auditors, David Armitage characterizes it as an event, a document, and the beginning of a genre. Now, Bridgman's version of the Declaration highlights that as a genre, the Declaration came to present a distinct but repeatable structure of argument and literary form that works at translingual contexts, right, undergoing change in circuits of exchange, both material and conceptual. Bridgman renders the Declaration in Chapter 4, 百姓之托，英国治治. The chapter echoes the metaphors of the universal body with which Bridgman introduced himself, as he sets up this claim for the readership to recognize the justification of the revolution. He repeats to the reader the shared intuition about what it means to be a good leader versus a tyrant. His account of the Declaration also makes key changes that bring China into the very center of the revolution. He portrays King George as a tyrant related to the East India Company that bars the colonies from trading directly with the Qing. Tea becomes central to the way Bridgman talks about the colonies' revolt. Right? They refuse to drink it, they boycott it, and he gives you a short summary of the Boston Tea Party of dumping IEC crates of tea into the ocean. Now, Bridgman echoes the original grievances of against the king. There are 18 in both documents, 18 major ones in both documents, and I want to focus then on 13 and number 18 again. So 13 is 英吉里王可波清凉多有牵制真挺毛衣大以常规茶园祭品上讲真其不有上浪往往自为法治而来小民. I know you can read it, and I know it's not this. I'm torturing myself up here, all right? Just thank you. I'm sorry. Okay, number 13. 某个上方丈并上描然 keyword, key phrase, 还及机民是志不相安也. The implication of Bridgman's phrasing, particularly of the 18th charge, garnered force in the two chapters that follow in brief account. First, in regard to the Mao people originally in the Americas, Bridgman dedicates chapter 6 to them. He generally offers a noble savagery rather than a merciless savagery of the original. This noble savagery appears throughout Bridgman's brief account, from his narration of Columbus's landing to the new land, his mention of Virginia settlement being saved by Pocahontas, settlers in Massachusetts take on Massasoit's name, and William Penn treating with the Indians, the Lenape, outside Philadelphia at the Shackamaxon Tree, which I'll come back to. In the general account, Indians fade away or are assimilated into the one body of the developing Christian United States of Commerce. Chapter 6 uses the term Miao, Miaoren, whose status as Yuanju, original residents, is eclipsed by settler colonists who become the Jumin or Turen. According to Bridgman, the first European traders to the Xianfang, new place, were deeply impressed by the Miaoren. Europeans noted that their copper skin and deep black eyes resembled Miao people from Asia. Bridgman rehearses the stereotype of natural history attending noble savagery, These Miaoren are upright in posture, strong in body, direct and honest in speech, stoic in the face of physical pain, valiant in war. However, these Yanju Miaoren are ignorant of where they originally come from. They have neither book nor ink. They hunt for food with arrows or fish or pick vegetables from the wild and have no knowledge of how to plow fields or to smoke meat to preserve it. They are ignorant on how to weave, leaving them sparsely clothed. Illness devastates them, and they have no recourse but to shout out to pagan spirits for cures. When times are good, they sing and dance, idling away their time. Bridgman's brief account bears clear similarity to, I don't know if people have read Thomas Harriot's brief account of Virginia, 1580s, Notes in the State of Virginia by Thomas Jefferson. In all three cases, the authors represent the indigenous people as healthy, noble, literate in a literally cultural sense, and illiterate. As Bridgman showcases the fecundity of the American place, he attests to the pliability of the Indians, who are easily managed, a devastating irony, given that as Bridgman's writing on this, Cherokee removal is happening in the United States, and fellow ABC FM members are protesting it and being incarcerated as they protest it. What's the implication for the Qing? On the friendly side, the use of the Miao follows up an analogy between the Qing government and the US that Bridgman sets geographically earlier in brief account. Its second chapter, Fanye Dushi, or degree of relations. Both the US and the Qing are powerful guo, bound to grow the extent of their territories. Jianqi, Jia, Zhang, both have an ocean to the east, both have a boundless vantage to the west. On their respective frontiers, both manage respective Miao Ren. This has nothing to do with the actual minority groups in China or actual Miao Ren that Laura Hostetler considers in the Qing colonial enterprise, and whom Bridgman, Williams, Lockhart, and many other missionaries had written about, the dozens and dozens of different type of Miao people, right? This is a foundational category that Bridgman is creating and using. However, Bridgman's invocation formulates an inter-imperial comparative indigeneity that admonishes the king to secure their station among the powers of the earth by respecting the opinions of mankind in trade. To do otherwise is to risk relegation, appearing more like the Miao as Manchu occupiers of China than a legitimate Tianxia dynasty. After all, the first Europeans to the New World had suspected that the American Miao Ren were originally from Asia. This subversion of Qing status among the powers of the earth is developed in chapter 5, HKIHSS, or short account of the opening of the country, meaning the United States, where he explains the US rules of governance and how they prioritize trade with neighbors near and far. He explains that after the Revolutionary War, the US's first task was to choose a leader to ensure that neighboring countries knew and respected the country's territory and had confidence in the United States as a trading partner. He then continues, 有使国内之规模陆力以备，乃利于邻国先堂之之以追，后使中华或之干。Okay, so the scale of after the scale or the extent of the country, the domestic country has been established, the next thing is to establish communication with neighboring countries. And to do this, he then outlines these three principles that then echo this one body solution. The first one is to regard the world as one family and not be self-proclaimed. Or second would be exchanges between two countries must be reciprocal or create one 统一体, and that in the midst of war, peace is the priority, and persuasion is we have to resolve into peace, right? 川和会上. Now, Bridgman goes on to outline that the U.S. has many neighbors of trading, have residential ambassadors, not only European peoples of France, Netherlands, England, Portugal, Spain, and many more, but also countries of Asia and Africa, Turkey, Morocco, Siam, as it was then called. Such open communication of trade and diplomacy builds strength of the U.S. and guarantees the general safety of good neighboring participants. Singularly absent from this list is the Qing, whom Bridgman qualifies with the following footnote. This terrible footnote, terrible footnote. Basically saying that, 各国皆有识之，独大清越东子午唯有贸易令是商人而已. All the countries of the United States, with whom the United States trades, have envoys. At the Qing in Canton, there's only trade advisors, right? They're the exception. Qing is the exception. They're not being good neighbors. They are not loving their neighbors as themselves. Now, this carries consequence that is devastating, as the implications of free trade turn to rationalize war and unequal treaties that set terms of extraterritoriality and indemnity that affect China for the next century. That's a big claim, and I want to kind of back it up and move kind of toward conclusion a bit by looking at some of the iconography and the allegories that are pervading Bridgman's invocation of good neighborness. His version of the Declaration is a generic adaptation of situated translation and cross-cultural analogies toward diplomatic ends. It's also historically significant for reflecting not only U.S.-China relations in the 19th century, but shading law of nations shaded into international law as free trade idealism shifted from the exclusionary premise of sovereignty under commercial Christendom's natural law into the exclusionary premise of civilized commerce under positivist international law. I see them both as exclusionary. This runs counter to a lot of writing about the way law of nations was inclusive and positivism exclusive. But as my paper ends, you'll see why I see both premised on an exclusionary premise and a moral reconditioning of trade. Bridgman's revision reformulates an inter-imperial comparative indigeneity as the Maoren organized what the scholar Emily Conrad Kurtz has called a hierarchy of heathenism. We can see what this hierarchy looks like by revisiting the illustration that concludes Joseph Tracy's History of American Missions to the Heathen in 1840. Recall that his brother was in Singapore, and with Liang Afa printing Bridgman's brief report, it's more than a coincidence, I think, that the brothers' parallel print endeavors reflect a general ideology of equating the free press with free trade as a basis of state sovereignty that is about interdependence among other states. From outside the circle of faith, the image, the icon of the ABCFM here is obviously imperialistic, even as it extends the Great Commission of Matthew 28:19 to go and teach all nations in response to the Macedonian call, which I'll come back to. The minister is both an individuated preacher and a figure of collective missionary enterprise, reaching to all places suggested by the human figures gathered as an audience under the tree. The differences in costume and color imply a relative status in regard to potential for conversion. The ABCFM image also echoes another iconic painting heralding free trade as the premise and potential for conversion in civilization of the heathen into a sovereign peer, Benjamin West's The Treaty of Penn with the Indians, that depicts William Penn at the middle ground, or the zone, or the contact zone of cultures, where he seems to be educating the Lenni Lenape on the procedures of conducting trade under the great elm outside Philadelphia at Shakamaxon, where Penn presents a bolt of cloth. The minister, in Tracy's version, holds a book in his hands. The closing circle of free trade and free press is represented here. Now, I could go on with these, but I think these images really bring relative power in this hierarchy. of heathenism alludes to another key Protestant allegory, the Macedonian call in Acts and St. Paul, where St. Paul heeds a call at the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire in Asia Minor, where he had been establishing churches and visiting Philadelphia at the time, Galatia, various places in Anatolia, modern Turkey, on the verge of moving eastward toward the harbor of Troy on the Aegean. A divine call from an apparitional man of Macedonia pleads for him to come over into Macedonia to help us. As Tracy tells it, Paul turns west, thus opening the door to the spread of Christianity throughout Europe. The colonization of British America continued the westward course of Christendom, commemorated by the colonial seal of Massachusetts. It obscures the exterminating violence of the Pequot War, King Philip's War against the Algonquin peoples of the Wampanoag, Narragansett, Nipmuc, and others. And I've put these two together. You can see the Massachusetts Bay Colony directly adopting the Macedonian call. And you can see the corporate seal of the ABCFM doing so, I guess, in a friendlier, more neighborly way. Now, why did the Great Commission and the Great Commandment function for Bridgman and the ABCFM as an obligation of sovereign recognition that straddled paradigms of law of nations and international law? To answer, we can weave a path back behind Vattel to Hugo Grotius, from Grotius back to the Catholic Dominican scholar Francisco de Vitoria, whom Arthur Nussbaum, among many, he's a legal scholar from the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, describes as the forerunner of evangelizing free trade commerce. Based on Vitoria's lecture De Indiis at the University of Salamanca, he is esteemed for resisting papal power over secular governments and for protecting the rights of Indians to hold land, to maintain their dominion, their property, their title to property, in the event of in the aftermath of putative Spanish discovery and conquest during the reign of King Ferdinand in 1513. Well, I go back to Vitoria. First, his writing evinces a long array of biblical exegesis that makes commerce and receptivity to evangelism a premise for recognizing non-Christian sovereignty. De Vitoria begins his lecture with an instruction of you to reread Matthew 28:19, "Go ye therefore and teach to all nations," and then turns to consider whether Indians have an exception to the way in which Spain has basically claimed their land. And he says, yes, they do. It's not a good neighborly thing to do to take the Indians' land. And he defends the Indians' right to dominion in this sense. But here's the double bind. Vitoria then goes on to align commerce with the propagation of faith. The Spanish have rights too. And they have a right under divine natural law, the law of nations, jus gentium, to communicate, which he means to visit, to travel through the land using common waters, using waters as commons. He tells us, interpreting Matthew 22:39, barbarians are obligated to love their neighbors as themselves, just like the Spaniards. They cannot prohibit trade with the Spanish, nor refuse to participate in it. He writes, quote, "The barbarians must permit the Spanish and the Christians to preach the gospel freely and without hindrance, for they can reject conversion, but they cannot reject evangelism." He continues, "If barbarians are asked and advised to listen to peaceful persuasion about religion and refuse to do so, they incur unpardonable mortal sin. Good neighbors have the responsibility to honor the Spanish merchants' rights to travel, peregrinandi, and the right to preach, jus praedicandi. What if the barbarians do not respect these rights of communication? What if they refuse them? Well, it's the basis for just war. As Victoria writes, brotherly correction is as much part of natural law as brotherly love. And since all peoples are merely in a state of sin, it is the business of Christians to correct and direct them. Indeed, they are clearly obliged to do so. They are our neighbors. There's a duty of, enough said. As Bridgman indicated, the Sermon on the Mount could serve as a foundational reference for a political economy where free trade is an offer that simply cannot be refused. As Bridgman implied, yeah. Now, if you wanted to follow this up, and I'm moving towards conclusion to my loose ends, we could look at the way Henry Wheaton is published. His Elements of International Law is picked up and published by W.A.P. Martin as Wang Guo Gong Fa. All right. Now, I show, I'm going to move towards conclusion and move off script here then. By just, in another talk, I go into Liang Fa, the way he's been set up in these images. And by the way, Bridgman and the ABCFM introduce him to their reading community. And they do so by putting him right into this Macedonian call, interpolating him, if you will, into the Macedonian call. Please come over, Boston missionaries, and help us, right? His image appears in Joseph Tracy's History, 1840. He sits there with his two sons. Actually, he didn't have two sons. He had one son, one daughter. So the daughter dies. Now, here it's a very orderly Liang Fa that juxtaposed with the images in Tracy's History of idolatry and these kind of like very Baroque and untamed images of the body is a very settled and ordered and civilized and Christian image of business, right? And also books and printing, right? Now, in terms of what happens to the Free Press, what happens to the Canton Press, well, it survives the First Opium War. It actually becomes the venue where versions of the first treaty between the United States and China are published, the Treaty of Wangxia. And Bridgman is one of the key translators helping Caleb Cushing do this. He's helping, well, he's basically editing this at this point. Liang Fa's son is helping in the process of this, Liang Qinde. At the beginning of the Second Opium War, Bridgman was in Shanghai. Bridgman was left behind, and he had spent the last year of the 1852 publication doing a general index to the Chinese repository, which I guess is a wonderful frontier. It's not really a frontier, everybody knows about it, but I think it's a fabulous source to consult. But this definitely ends with a whimper and not a bang. He watches also the entire print station of the Canton Press go up in, well, he doesn't see it happen, but he comes the day after, and it's all destroyed. All the print equipment, all the back issues of the Chinese repository, and then many other things that they published. So what are the conclusions? Well, not to restate the obvious, I think my main conclusion is I'm fascinated by the way that in translating the Declaration, Bridgman uses it as a genre and introduces this imperial comparative indigeneity of the Miao, right? And the Miao Ren work as a sort of transit point to both pull in a relation of neighborliness and differentiate the Qing. I'm also fascinated by the way that by reading the translation of the Declaration into Chinese, one goes back to the original US Declaration of Independence and reads it differently. Thank you.
I'll just make it quickly, some of my reaction to that, by reading these things. The first thing is really about the translatability or just translation of the original text. The original text, we're talking about the Declaration of Independence. Now, you already point out many of these things, but I don't want to repeat that. And also the free trade focus and the diplomacy behind that and so forth. I think so very convincingly put up those ideas. But there some kind of reaction to that was for example, my understanding is there are some, how would say, of course there are 27 counts against the British monarch. But he was doing bad things, and I think your title suggests good governance. So he was doing things that's against good governance, right? So that justified the revolution and independence. Now we'll move up a little bit more. Then actually, what is good governance, right? And the good governance actually came from the first few parts that you read it. You know, those are really the things that we're so familiar with. You know, all men were created equal, and then they were endowed with the unalienable rights, right? And then the rights include, among others, you know, the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, the interesting thing is how was this translated at this stage? All men were created equal. So the translation is 大小同体, right? So 大小同体. So big or small, you know, you're all the same, right? In your description, I mean, in your presentation, of course, you know, this is in one body of the Christ. That's easy to understand in this context. But if you look at the Chinese text, you know, 大小同体, I don't think any Chinese will ever imagine that, right? Before they become a Christian. And how are they going to sell these ideas, 大小同体, to the Chinese Mandarins or Chinese elites? That is something that's very, you know, it's a puzzle to me. And actually, I found that Wei Yuan translated the same thing in a slightly different manner. Instead of 大小同体, so big and small, the same essence. I would translate the T as essence, not the body. But in Wei Yuan later, that's very interesting. Wei Yuan is not a missionary, right? But he definitely, a lot of things were copied from this. He translates 万族, so all the different people were equal. So in other words, what I'm saying is that you couldn't really get that idea. If you move away this one, then actually the other things will be very difficult to imagine. Actually, there was no mention at all of those three unalienable rights at all. There's no mention at all. And the only thing I could imagine is someone like 各安其位. 各安其位. In Chinese, I mean, you never imagine there's anything to do with unalienable rights. Now, anyway, so what I'm thinking is very interesting in the translation in that way, but then it's maybe more interesting to translate them back, a reverse translation into English. Then I think that will be, and you're doing something like that as well, but I think that will be very interesting to trace how they are sharing the ideas. If we translate it back to English, and actually for English reader will be much better. Now, the other thing is really my wide imagination. Why free trade can represent the idea or embody the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Actually, I would imagine something. I just see, you know, just throw in and see how you react. Liberty is freedom, right? Of course, it's freedom. So free trade, the first word is freedom, right? So freedom. And then trade, the second word is trade. Trade is for livelihood. Without livelihood, you don't have life, right? So life, the basic material foundation for life is that. Pursuit of happiness, again, the same thing. Without livelihood, without life, you don't have pursuit of happiness. But on the other hand, through trade, you can also pursue material happiness. So I think somehow these three concepts, in a sense, you know, of course, I'm making it up myself, but it seems that there will be some kind of implication that we might be able to talk about. There must be something. There must be something wrong here that the paper run away from me. Okay, so finally, I want to really think about the one thing is you rightly mentioned. I think it's very convincing to me that, you know, this is a free trade sort of a focus of theme there. And behind that is also diplomacy, because the free trade is not domestic. They're talking about free trade across the nation. So then they form diplomacy. But on the other hand, it's really about the intention of translating this thing. So they're translating this primarily as a missionary than a diplomat. That is the question I have in mind. So I'm sure you must have some answer to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Well, I'll start maybe go backwards. Just okay. So no, it's fine. Oh, not at all. So the way in which this comes out of Bridgman's total career is after 1834 and 1835 in the Society of Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, missionaries changed their tack. And they're basically saying, well, if we're not going to just be able to continue publishing biblical tracts or Liang Faz, basically distributing like the good words to admonish an age. Let's prove that we're better through these printing processes by informing people about facts, like geographies. The geographical information becomes very powerful, according to the missionaries' intentions, of showing the Chinese why they need to be listening to the missionaries, right, and opening up to their tracts otherwise, right? Now, so that's the turn towards, I guess, useful knowledge. So Bridgman's bridging information, delivering back to the United States, but also into, well, the circuit of printing that he imagines, into China, but mostly around the Qing regulation in Singapore and Malacca, Batavia, Penang, all the way, yeah, that's right, Straits settlements. Now, the next part about diplomacy is, well, he kind of takes that up because he's there. Now, if you read the Chinese repository, he is right there as Commissioner Lin enacts the confiscation and destruction of the opium. And Bridgman's writing about it. And Peter Parker, who's coming and running this hospital, is talking to Commissioner Lin about how to translate Vattel, right? And asking Peter Parker to work with Yuan Dehui and Liang Jinde, like Liang Fa's son, to write this letter to the Queen, right? So that's where the diplomatic role starts to take shape. Now, after the war, Bridgman's at the center of negotiating the Treaty of Wangxia, right? Bridgman will become a key translator for the Treaty of Tianjin later on. And they write about this, right? They're writing back to the United States. They're writing about this in articles and also their historical accounts, right? So I find that tangle fascinating, the way that and you know what? They change their mind about what they can do with printing the Word of God. And the Taiping Rebellion, which I didn't mention here, is a fundamental disillusioning event to them, right? They realize like they can't control the exegesis, they can't control the interpretation, right? And Bridgman goes with Robert McFarland to visit Nanjing, right? Partly to figure out what's going on. And he walks away and says, the earlier optimism I had in 1851, 1852 is done, right? They are basically blasphemous in what they're doing, right? So that diplomacy and evangelical commitment to print and its failure is fascinating too, because I don't think it's a failure that doesn't matter. I think it's a failure that highlights some mistakes that reoccur in a different way, right? And back to the question of then trade, right? Free trade. One thing I find fascinating about, and I'll be quick. No, it's fine. Usually when you think about the way that Spanish imperialism works, it's centered on notions of title, property. Indians don't hold title, and the Supreme Court rulings about Indian removal are about that. Indians just can't hold title. They're not civilized, Christian. Of course Indians can trade. That was never seemingly contested. Everyone's trading all the time, right? So that's the pressure point usually to thinking about the way federal Indian removal happens, right? It's really about what trade happens and you can regulate it, but property's what. When you get to the way in which Bridgman's thinking about opium smuggling and his presence in South China, they're not trying to own title to Chinese property or land. What they are trying to do is control trade. And then it's like, well, where does that come in sort of the longer evangelical theological philosophy? And that's why I go back to Vittoria. And he's basically saying, yeah, you can't take their land, but they have to trade with you, right? It's not literal trade that he's talking about. It's like they can't. So this is where it becomes about reasonability. It's like trade regulation we all think is reasonable, right? I mean, fentanyl isn't something that shouldn't be regulated as a trade commodity, and nor should have opium been, right? But the way in which this particular formulation of free trade works is to get around the right of regulating it, right? and then to make a standoff around confiscation of property, which is opium, right? Brings us back then to the one body. Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and what I find fascinating is the way Bridgman is trying to be as simple as he can as he begins this discussion and presentation. He's not talking about rights, right? And he's not talking about individual rights at all. He's talking about the heart, right? And we all have like this heart, and we all are parts of the body, a shen, right? And we're connected, and we're neighbors, and we're contiguous, right? And that contiguity is what he's emphasizing. It might not be that you're right next to the country, but you, as you travel, and he talks about this, as I learned I had friends everywhere, right? Peace and friendship is what I discovered. But you better trade with me. You better listen to me preach, right? And he's not really advocating war, except the moments when he does, for different reasons. But my point is that these allegories of hearts and friendship and freedom are really about obligation. And these are offers you cannot refuse. And the sort of magic mirror moment is, this isn't really about trade, but it's about the premise of regulating it. And that's what's really denied Commissioner Lin in that moment. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. How much time? How much time do we have? Huh? So can I open to the floor for, let's say, 3 questions? Yes. So please. And so, sorry, we are running late. So we can entertain only 3 questions. Can I know anyone who want to raise questions? So 1 question, and then we have, okay, 2 questions. The last question, anyone? Otherwise, we only have 2 questions. Thank you.
All right, I have one short question for Elizabeth, one short question for Kendall, right?
Okay,
so Elizabeth, you talk about the dwelling in Tianjin. I think the one photo there about the bedroom in Arctic, then the first floor, then the servant live in the basement. So who occupied the bedroom in the Arctic in Tianjin at that time? Because the reason I'm asking this question, because a while ago, that a Chinese teacher at Harvard, Gu Konghua, people thought he died or he caught the pneumonia because he think he, as a master, have to stay on the top of the slavery, the servant. So some people suspect, but we don't have evidence. He may caught the pneumonia when he stayed in the Arctic bedroom. Because Tianjin, I don't know the heating system. I don't know how the Arctic get the heating, right? It's cold. So that's one question. For Kendall, I'm so intrigued by the translation. Say they call the Indians as a Miaoren. Why Miaoren, right? See, yeah, the Miaoren. No, Indians, right? Yeah, okay, that's a short question. Okay, yeah.
I'll just answer really quickly. I haven't found any sort of written or archival evidence about who slept in what bedroom. So, yeah, so I don't know who would have slept in the attic bedroom.
Yeah, so I select quotes strategically, but what is fascinating is when the Spanish first come, they don't call them Miaoren, they call them Turen, right? Yuan Turen, like the beginning Earth people. But then the settlers, they get that term, right? And the Jumin, the Turen and the Jumin are the colonists, right? And that's the switch that Bridgman makes. So by the time we get to the Declaration, and he's putting the 18th charge, it's the Miaoren who are being agitated. And in the 6th chapter, it's not the beginning of the Turen, it's the beginning of the Miaoren, right? And
in Chinese, basically, Miaoren has applied to specific groups.
And he knows this, and he's written on them, and he's basically in this particular chapter saying, yeah, Miaoren look like Asian people, and the Qing, you have your own Miaoren too, right? So he's introducing a lot of strategic ambiguity. about what exactly this Miaoren, this kind of root culture is, right? This and the Tu and the Jumin, like the people who have the place, right? They're the colonists. They're the Meiguo. Right?
Could I follow up a little bit? Okay, yeah. Because the translation, the book was published in 1838. Right? I noticed they use the term 中国 called China. Is this person the first one? Because when you mentioned the later on the element of international law, right? That basically sometimes the Martin has a trouble to figure out certain terms, but you were Beethoven actually at that time figure out certain terms as early as 1838. That's a big.
Yeah.
I don't know. He came out with the idea, or his Chinese assistant came out with that.
Very well could have been his try. He is credited for reviving the term Maoyi for trade, which I was going to respond to that earlier too. So the way that Bridgman is talking about what trade is, like whether it's like Tongyi, whether it's agreement, whether it's contiguous relations, or but Maoyi is the term that he begins to use. By the time we get to Martin translating Wheaton, he's not using Miaoren. He's actually phonetically rendering Cherokee, right? And he's talking directly about Indian removal, as would Wheaton, at the very same time that Bridgman's writing this, right? And one observation is that what Bridgman has done is completely erase Indian removal, which is incredibly ironic given that it's happening to his fellow missionaries at this time. Yeah.
Yes, I have a quick question, actually, also for the both of you. And I start with Elizabeth's presentation. So I think this is very convincing. You showed us how, you know, the modern, however we call it, and traditional, the Chinese and the foreign blend together in the world, you know, in the urban world of Tianjin, so-called, you know, like the Shanghai modern, a Tianjin modern, and we can say in a 3D port modern, or that world that emerges. Now, I have a question. Aren't there also tensions? Because especially, for instance, when it comes to gender, women had a hard time balancing these different roles, the expectations that the society still had. I remember reading about discussions in the Chinese, you know, National Assembly, for instance, on things like divorce, right, and so on and so forth. And a similar thing I would like to ask Kendall, because also here in the translations, terms emerge, but there might be different meaning behind it. So I liked the point that Professor Zhou was making, that if you translate it back, you know, these different interpretations might come forward. So I wonder how we balance, you know, the tensions as well as the efforts of bridging, so to speak.
Yeah, this is a great question. Thank you. You know, you mentioned the Tianjin modern and the Shanghai modern, and one of the things I'm trying to argue is that, you know, the Shanghai modern, if you read in magazines at the time, it's always described as modern, 现代, 某登. It's never, you never talk about this is Chinese, this is Western, this is traditional, this is always modern. So this is sort of like how the Shanghai modernists thought of themselves. So sort of on par with Tokyo, New York, it's modern. Whereas Tianjin knew they were on the periphery. So they're always like, well, we're not like Shanghai. And so the Tianjin modern is very honest about the tensions because they also know they're sort of on the periphery. So one way you get the tensions actually is in advice columns. When you're talking about all of these new foreign things entering the home, they make messes that you have to clean up. Like, how do you deal with dirt on your new high heel shoes because you're going in and out? How do you deal when like Western ink doesn't sort of causes a stain seeping out of Chinese paper? So the magazines are very aware, the Tianjin magazines are aware of the tensions. Now you bring up the idea of divorce, And in some ways, this is linked to what Kendall is talking about, because sometimes the things that we think of as the sort of marks of modernization cause more problems, like this issue of divorce. So I think what's really important here in this story is the ways in which missionaries kind of tied together Christian ideology, law, the sort of supremacy of American and European law, and trade. It's all part of the same package. So that when they sort of institute free trade, it comes at the expense of extraterritoriality. And so, you know, the very same guys that Guoqi was talking about earlier, who are like sick man of Asia, it's because they've had all of this imposed upon them. And one of the things that Chinese people really have to do is show that their law is modern so that they can get their territories back, so they can get rid of extraterritoriality. And so the civil code doesn't come about until early 1930s. And one of the things to show we're modern, we're going to give women property rights, and we're going to have, like, you know, the right to divorce. But then we see, we'll take property away from the jia, the household, and put it in the hands of individuals. So this is supposed to be good for women and women's rights, and then we'll show the Europeans and the Americans that we're modern. But actually, it has a backlash. I argue it bolsters the property rights of individual men. And so I find, one of my favorite cases I find is this couple that I discovered, and I discovered these actually in Nantes, in the French diplomatic archives, because you can't find things about property in Tianjin archives for many reasons. But there's this couple, and she owns the property's in her name, and she tries to mortgage it and get some cash. And her husband is a diplomat in the US. He discovers it. He sends a letter to the French concession, says, "Don't let my wife deal with this property. Only me or my husband can." But it's in her name. And at the same time, he's writing these articles for the Rotarian in San Francisco saying, in China, we are so modern, men and women and blah, blah, blah. But then there's this tension going on. So sometimes, like, the rhetoric of modernization and equality, or even the law, creates these backlashes as well, these tensions.
Okay, I'll give you two parts to the answer. First is both short. One would be the social historical context of the translation that's happening, and the arguments between the missionaries from Morrison to Medhurst to Bridgman to Gutzlaff into the Union version of the Bible. They're having committees and arguing constantly. And the Chinese assistants, from Liang Afa to his son, Liang Jinde, dipping in and out of these conversations, and they're looking for a stable grammar, stable terms. And that's part of what's interesting about going back and seeing the way the same text appears differently in 1838, 44, and 1861. And then reading people like Massimini's, and Lydia Liu, who go back to these texts and say, these are the terms that were stabilized out of these documents, whether it be about sovereignty or rights, or, but in terms of the shading or the question of, like, well, how do I go into this? Like, are they using Wenli or Guanhua? Like, what kind of Mandarin is being created in some ways? At the same time, they're trying to imagine audience. Well, there are scholars like Lydia Liu who goes after the super signifier, the super sign, right? The yi, right? She's saying, like, here it is. This was basically a weaponized translingual semiotic, right? And look what it could do. And Reef Derlich is like, I don't think it's that important at all. Like, who cares about, you're basically getting into the minutia of, and maybe this is a critique on methodologies, right? You have people who basically say that you can't translate in ways that matter politically. Emily Apter's book, Eric Chafitz's book. Imperialism, the metaphor itself is imperialistic, right? It's about moving meaning across divisions, across boundaries and borders that recreate property, the proper, right? You have more optimistic Sean Saucy's citation as translation, which I think is what I'm basically borrowing from, although you can notice I'm pretty skeptical that this isn't about imperialism. I think it's just a kinder, gentler form of imperialism. But I think the reason I look at it and I'm fascinated by it is because it goes back so far and then just keeps changing and coming back. So free trade today is not the free trade of now. That's not my point. And I'm not against commerce in any way. But I am against free trade that pretends that it's about negotiation when it's actually about extraction and gunboat diplomacy, right? And that's not something you can go back to as a standard, right? So that's what animates my question about what was Maui back then and how, what was free trade? And free trade has lots of layers of meaning then. So I hope that's.
Well, okay. So thank you so much for the presentation.